Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about the fourth chapter of Developments in French Politics. This chapter goes into the partisan changes that happened in France, especially up to the 2017 elections, and a little bit of discussion into the parliamentary changes, both up to that point and even afterwards from my side investigation into these topics. In the beginning of the French Fifth Republic, there was relative coexistence between the two big center-right and center-left parties. By the 80s, the Socialists had formed as a part of the new major left-wing bloc, the Parti Socialiste, and the Front National was created as a far-right fringe group at this time. And eventually the UMP, which later renamed itself the Les Républicains, developed as the major center-right bloc to challenge the socialists and to dilute the power of the Front National's far-right rhetoric. So, following the financial crisis in the late aughts, the appetite for more radical stances reoriented the major parties to skew further to the extreme on their respective sides to appeal to those sentiments that they saw as growing. But this came at the cost of the center and their center support from both of their own parties. The left specifically saw this rise in support for themselves with François Hollande's presidential win in 2012, but his leaving in political tarnishes by 2017 made these socialist and left-wing politics less appealing than before. The Parti Socialiste saw members leave the party as it worked to be more left-wing by 2017, and many of the those who did not like this far left turn were seeking a more moderate alternative, or those who actually did like this far left turn were actually seeking it in another party, including France Insoumise or France Unbowed party. The Parti Socialiste eventually fell from this grace of power that it once held, and as even its own headquarters in Paris had to be sold off later. So Les Républicains, they confronted a similar issue from another side with the growing power of Front National as it was siphoning votes away from them, especially following Jean-Marie Le Pen's strong 2002 presidential campaign. And they too, the Républicains, were deciding to convert to more radical ideas, which, similar to Parti Socialiste, didn't work out in their favor neither, as voters either found that party, the Républicains, to just become too radical, or those voters simply wanted the actual real radical parties and thus would go to Front National. So Nicolas Sarkozy's presidency utilized these elements of glitziness, which isolated the traditional conservatives on the Républicains party, as well as his far-right rhetoric alienated many of the moderates in his own party, which only further cemented the already occurring loss of moderation that was happening in the party in the post-aughts financial crisis. So by 2012, a power vacuum occurred within the party, and the years following Sarkozy's loss were marked by a disharmony over the direction of the party, which in the end led to reinstating Sarkozy as a leader to prepare for the 2017 elections. However, Sarkozy made the unfortunate decision to call a primary for the party, assuming he and the moderate leader would battle it out, only for an unexpected victory for the far-right François Fillon to win this nomination for Les Républicains, which was a further right turn for the party that was seen as more unstable, and this era was marked as just as much drama under Sarkozy in this time up to the 2017 campaign. And the party was unfortunately ineligible for the second round of voting in the presidential elections. So they also suffered the similar effect of losing moderates, as the socialists did, to Les Républiques En Marche, which was Macron's party in the 2017 elections. And this also just influenced the Républicains to just steer further to the right after losing so many moderates also. So Macron made victory in the 2017 elections by running on this image of appeal for voters as the real definer of the movement and not really the policies alone, but just Macron's image. And this self-inflicted damage of the major party blocs also supported Macron's image as a change from traditional politics, as well as he cemented his ability as a true centrist candidate by appointing moderate figure roles in his government. So Macron never positioned himself as truly centrist, though, as he had appeared a bit more to the center-right. And this was because the left up to 2017 was essentially seen as dying on its own sword, as many saw. So they did not want to bother trying to take more left-wing voters when they could tell we're already coming towards them. Also because there was a growing right-wing voter body in France that it appeared as if. And also, Les Républicains, they at this point of the 2017 elections seemed to be the real threat to the République en Marche's victory, especially in the Senate, as they had a strong holding there. And they wanted, the République en Marche wanted to siphon off those voters to get rid of the true threat to their party. So once this happened in the second round of voting, it was just the République en Marche versus Front National, the far right-wing party. And Front National stood as the only threat up to this point, but not really a strong threat, as the République en Marche positioned itself as a centrist but not so extreme political party against the Front National's radicalism. So once taking office, Macron has scrapped the parliamentary reserve that gave representatives sums of money for supporting their own constituents and constituencies. But the issue of the acquisition of these funds, now that the leaders in the Assemblée Nationale had to acquire, was another issue, as because of a lack of a national level of accountability, there was now a concern over where was this money coming from and for what purposes, without a national body truly keeping them accountable. And this is now actually seen a reverse in a push for reinstituting a type of parliamentary reserve again since this book was published. And other changes, like creating a more proportional electoral system and having term limits, have been pushed by Macron, but they have yet to see any success. And some of these reforms raise questions whether it'll institute a more democratic parliament or just a parliament and parliamentary system, or are these efforts more just to serve to Macron's power interests, especially in centralizing the power around the president. One of these is the move to reduce the number of seats in both chambers, which aims to increase the means of resource disposals for their constituencies, and it's seen as a more effective way of getting the work done. But it is also seen that by reducing the work for constituencies, by making many people go under one single leader, it instead looks as if it instead focuses attention towards the national level, which Macron leaves, and not so much the constituents' concerns, having less leader proportion as before. So, even though this is still hypothetical. So Macron's party win in 2017 elections also saw a major overhaul in parliament's composition, which instituted these newer and less experienced members into the French parliament, and many acted enthusiastically for the République en Marche's policies, and focused more on the central government than their own constituent levels in the beginning. Over time, these members grew fatigued of being a rubber stamp for the République en Marche and just for Macron's policies. And instead, they began over time to reorient their powers and their interests into their own constituencies, much as their predecessors did before, and that they used to call as an incompetent way of governing. And many of these leaders started to react more independently than simply just wanting to pass all of Macron's legislation without any resistance, at least. So now Parliament has seen it has seen a regressive turn to what the old Parliament's slower pace of policy after that brief change in the 2017 elections is now showing a reversal back to that similar organization over time. And additionally, from reading about what has happened following the publication, following 2022, the elections then, the Ensemble Coalition, the one that Le République En Marche was a part of and still is, which that party now, the République En Marche, is now called Renaissance Party. So the Ensemble Coalition that Renaissance Party is a part of had lost their parliamentary majority in the 2022 elections. So rather than a strong center now, as we saw in the post-2017 elections, there has now been a firm three-way bloc that has cemented with Renaissance in the center, Front National, which is now called National Rally, as the far-right party. And now there is actually, since 2024, in the snap elections, and there is now the new far left-wing party, Nouveau Front Populaire, or the NFP, and this became a further cementing by 2024 of those snap elections. And NFP is becoming an increasingly influential party in French politics recently, as it is almost tied to National Rally's influence, it seems. Since the publication of this book, Parliament has been working at a slower pace, just as it has following the whole change in 2017, including the recent votes of no confidence that have continued to plague Macron's leadership, now as it is with its fifth prime minister in just 2 years, trying to pass a budget. So looking back now at the radical directions that the Parti Socialiste and the Républicains sought following the financial crisis, we can consider them now with hindsight bias that these were misreadings into what should have been employed for their respective parties' new leadership. We can't say that what was misread was the appeal of radicalism and radical approaches, because that part is true in evaluating the direction French politics has taken since and continues to take. But the real issue was the major bloc parties' belief that they could be the ones to lead this change. The bandwagoning of these parties to turn more radical failed for what seems like two critical reasons. The first being that radical ideologies, like those from National Rally, are based on going against the status quo and institutions such as Les Républicains. So using the right-wing example, Les Républicains' decision to commit to the cause of the radical right ideology that parties like that National Rally embodied are based as much on its right-wing policies as much as it being seen as the antithesis to the perceivingly failing policies of governments that under Sarkozy and other leaders from the conventional right-wing bloc, which includes the Républicains, which then makes it hard for the Républicains to reposition themselves as against the very system that they are. The Républicains was essentially a sheep in wolf's clothing trying to, in this attempt to appeal to far right-wing voters, because the party itself is really what gives parties like National Rally so much more appeal for committing to not electing the Republicans, and they're seen as incompetent and moderate approaches to begin with. The second reason for the failure of this type of bandwagoning effect that the parties took is the loss of appeal towards the center bloc, the other side of this part. So using the left-wing example now, the socialists' motion to adopt more radical left-wing ideologies also just isolated voters who just weren't as strongly committed and or didn't believe in the use of radical ideas in a fight fire with fire approach for something like radical left or even radical right-wing politics. The Parti Socialiste had just as much a responsibility to the further to the left voters in their party as those closer to the center left on their own party. Because radical ideas remain radical for a reason, in that they are unorthodox to the conventional center-left, center-right political discourses that the Parti Socialiste and the Republicans represented. This is perhaps why radical politics are also best performed by those fringe groups like National Rally for right-wing politics. So when the radical parties are flirted with, when radical parties' ideologies are flirted by mainstream parties like Les Républicains, it just comes across to voters less as an understandable change to the success of the political party that they might identify with, and instead it almost looks like the mainstream party's invalidating of the centrist appeal in their own party for many original French voters who sought those politics in that party to begin with as a way of winning, and for compromise to be perceived. And many of those voters also just seem to want to compromise, to persevere for the sake of a functioning state, and not necessarily because they believe in the firm left or firm right beliefs in politics only. So when evaluating what became of these socialists by the end of Hollande's presidency, it resembles a similar political tragedy we see in many left-wing causes, at least in the US, that I can relate to. So something like the post-George Floyd era in law and order politics in the United States, where policing was seen as a hot-button issue for many on the left, and those wanting more accountability measures and others who sought a motion to even defund the police, provides an excellent example of what I'm trying to point out here. Now, this isn't to say that the right does not have a variety of political opinions on their general policies that can also create heated debate, but the left and right have two consistent factors I have witnessed in the US and has some relevance in French left-right-wing politics. And it is that while both the left and the right will have multiple political objectives for the same causes in different forms, the right has a history by comparison to the left, of putting up an appearance of working more jointly in shared policy demands. Whereas the left has a history that is comparatively more multifaceted and incoherent in their appearance and policy demands. Now, I don't intend to use these words as a way of insulting the left, but I mean to point out that for something like the post-George Floyd calls for police reform, there was a clear demarcation within left-wing American politics and people seeking accountability measures versus the more radical motions to defund police funding, or to institute a defunding of the police budgets, and even some seeking to just eliminate the police departments in select cities altogether. The right, on the other hand, has shown itself in line with the party's policies and with a bit more coherence by comparison, including the American example of supporting the reversal of the Roe v. Wade abortion ruling just a year after, to protect states' rights over abortion laws that saw a comparatively more unified support amongst the American right than did the left in the aforementioned issue in 2020. So emphasis lies on the word appearance here, as I'm discussing, because this is only the front that we can safely evaluate. We don't have a good idea of behind the scenes, and I am sure that the resistance within the right wing of politics for both the US and France is just as influential as the left's. Yet the left wears its heart on its sleeve in a way for some of these causes, which just makes it easier to perceive a lack of unity on the side for the public to judge. So Hollande's presidency is an epitome of this issue translated into French politics, where unity behind the socialist president remained contentious from his own left-wing bloc that eventually pulled out in their own support. Sarkozy, the predecessor to Hollande, faced similar issues within his own party as well. But what can be discerned from both presidents is that the right did not give Sarkozy a comparatively hard time as the left did for Hollande, but to the point that Hollande refused to run for a second term due to a clear lack of support. I have no clear advice to give here, as this is really just my observations, but the optics of these two political parties and political phenomenons of the parties shows a discernible pattern in the political tragedy that marks many left-wing presidents, at least. Looking at what happened with the Renaissance Party's win in 2017 in the Parliament, that created an overhaul in the parliamentary body with the revolution of political centrism, we can almost treat that change as an experiment into the consistent issue of revolutions, and specifically the day after question. The day after the revolution, what happens? Political revolution is a term that spurs up so much excitement and discomfort for the fact that it entails the promise of a change in the old guard that for many is seen as incompetent or illegitimate. Historically, we can look back to the Russian or the American revolutions as examples of a massive change in replacing the old ways of governance with a newer practice. Both were seen as for their respective representative groups, the Bolsheviks for the workers, and the Patriots for the colonists who no longer consider themselves British. But in the end, the day after proved itself a contentious issue in the fulfillment of these revolutionary promises. The Bolsheviks instituted a vanguard rule with elites in charge of the USSR, which didn't differ much in the authoritarian aspect of the Tsardom as before, whereas the Founding Fathers created an initially more exclusive government, including upholding slavery, while portraying itself as the land of the free. Even the French revolutions from the late 18th and up to the mid-19th centuries led to a roller coaster of hazy results, from First Republic to Empire to Republic again. What these revolutions show is that there is no easy way to define a revolution as successful, because of the different meanings that revolution holds for many. And whether the consequences lived up to those standards is up for interpretation. So looking at the Renaissance Party's parliamentary wins in 2017, this similar story occurs, where what was originally seen as the groundbreaking move for politicians to focus their efforts on effective national governance that abandoned the ineffective, slower governance of their predecessors only ended up returning back to the old guard's slow pace of government in action. As the new leaders came to realize over time why the old guard, was the old guard, acted in such a way in the first place, and finally being in their position and gaining some experience. What this situation came to show was that the way how things were done was not necessarily an incompetent or illegitimate concept in politics or government. But what this is the result of situations that their predecessors have faced. A strong presidential government where the parliamentary leader's real power really only comes from an inaction of moving along the powerful president's agenda. Revolution should thus be scrutinized with this historical precedent into just what exactly is the point of the revolution, as the day after question tends to reinstitute a similar system as before, just only under new leaders with some changes. After all, the word revolution also means a going in a circular motion, and thus returning to the starting point after such a massive change. That's one way of looking at it. And for many revolutions, many of these revolutions that I did point out, those results, the Russian, the American, even the French revolutions never truly came into fruition until years after and even decades after the revolution first occurs that we can truly discern whether a revolution failed or succeeded in its aims. In the end, revolution itself continues to prove itself a contentious term in defining political change, and whether its results were intended and or successful by whatever measurement of that word. Thank you for watching this, and I will see you guys in the next one.